Do you see this? A year ago, someone sold a pair of Steve Jobs' old Birkenstocks at the Hard Rock Cafe at an auction for $220,000. That was a year ago. That's mental, isn't it? Do you know what else happened a year ago? This, the Synology DS923. This is a NAS that we were talking about for quite a while. We did a big old review and we've done loads of videos throughout the course of the year. Now, if you're watching this video today, chances are you are doing it because either you're an existing owner of the DS923 and you're wondering is it still good to keep the pace, or two, you're considering buying it during your Black Fridays, your end of year stuff, and ultimately a year has gone by and you're wondering, one, is it still worth your bunts, and two, is there something better along the way? And that's what today's video is. It's going to be a very quick 1 year later on this device. We're going to talk about the things that have aged well, like a lovely wine or some decent cheese, and other things that have not aged well, like bad wine and bad cheese. So let's crack on with the opening credits and talk about this device and whether it's still worth your money and your data 1 year later. Now, straight off the bat, I'm going to tell you, this video is about skirting over the highlights. It is about talking lightly about this device. It is not an in-depth review of performance benchmark. We've already done those and they'll be linked in the description or no doubt on the side of the screen thanks to YouTube. But this video is to talk about within that last year and what's aged well about this. Let's crack on with that straight away. The price tag. When this first rolled out the gate a year ago, one of the early, I'm not going to say heavy praise, but I will say positives, was that despite it rocking out the gate with ECC memory, despite rocking out the gate with the option of 10 GB upgrades, and despite rocking out the gate being able to do pretty much everything that DSM and Synology's applications both in and outside the system can do, it maintained a very similar, if not identical, price point to the DS920 that came before it. But moreover, 1 year down the line, they've not only maintained that price point, but we've seen on offer throughout the year so many times. It would have been very easy for Synology, given this thing's hardware architecture and its reshaping of their hardware portfolio, moving this a little bit higher than the home user categories because they had something of a rejig of a lot of their releases, more on that later. The result was that this is actually available at quite a decent little price, and the number of times throughout the year I've seen numerous retailers putting this out there for about 500 nicker, when originally at launch it was 550 to 600. Now, I'm not just talking about your Black Fridays and your Prime Days, I am talking bog standard sales, and if you search around you can get this brand new, again, 450 or 500 in some cases, with phenomenal offers, particularly in Europe, I will say as well. The other thing I will say, and we sort of already touched on that, is in the year since this has been released, this one got released, the DS423, and that was kind of one of the biggest areas of contention when this came out, because Synology had basically taken their portfolio, which was value, low entry tier, then there was home and fully featured prosumer, and then it went into entry-level business, and then went into serious high-capacity business and above. And they looked at that portfolio and they squished some things. Now, since then, we've learned why. Number one, the bottom tier, the J and the potential value tier, it looks like they are going to gradually disappear. And they're going to be replaced by pre-populated devices running on an OS known as B-Station or BSM. One of the earliest devices we've seen, a little one bay called the BST150. And it looks like this is going to be rocking out in 1s and 2s, and maybe even 4-bay devices that are going to eliminate that entry-level tier with systems that roll out with pre-populated storage on them, and with them having slightly more streamlined operating systems. Now, with that, what they've done is rejig the layers. The next layer, that home layer, became that one, the DS423 with its Intel Celeron processor. So when this first came out, after a relative 3 years of silence from the brand, 2.5, 3 years, depending on where you are in the world, a lot of users were disappointed with the hardware this arrived with, because it was a lot more businessy focused. It's CPU, an AMD embedded Ryzen. It's memory, ECC memory, which is a lot more expensive. Its inclusion of the 10 GB upgrade, which, although pleasing for some, also felt like it wasn't fair that these standard network interfaces were 1 gig. It was kind of an either or with no middle ground there. So 1 year later, this system kind of makes a lot more sense in Synology's portfolio, because now they've started fleshing out that rejigging of their portfolio, and the releases have started to get a little bit more resynced as they started releasing them. And not only have we seen more value series devices, possibly the last of their kind for a number of those series in the DS423, the DS223, and some of the J series boxes, but this one has become far more appealing in its bracket between the home and the business user. Now, another reason that this has become more appealing, it has to be said, is not only has that rocked out the gate for the lower tier multimedia user, but its hardware architecture, that DS423, and we'll talk about this in another video in the 6 months since its release, is a little bit underwhelming. A lot of users that are looking at these two devices with a price difference between them of around 70 to 100 Nika will suddenly see that this is better value overall. Not only because the memory's more upgradable, the network's more upgradable, but users are finding that some of the abilities that this was able to provide in terms of multimedia transcoding, there are workarounds, there are ways around, and ultimately this becomes a lot more appealing for those users at a point when its only point of comparison was a DS920. But that's enough about the DS423, we'll save that for its own video. But another reason why this has become increasingly more appealing in the 12 months since it's been released is because of the developments within Synology's own platform, DiskStation Manager. In the 12 months since this was released, Synology have rolled out DSM7.2, and in DSM7.2, new features have been rolled out in the form of volume encryption and, of course, write once, read many. These improvements that have been rolled out are very much in the wheelhouse of this hardware architecture. Unsurprising, that's clearly what Synology were going for. It's just a shame that this arrived before those software updates were fully established, and therefore its advantages couldn't really be felt. Write once, read many, allowing you to create genuinely immutable, undestroyable backups there, protection from ransomware, protection from long-term archival storage getting accidentally ruined. The same goes with volume encryption to stop some of that data when it falls into the wrong hands being accessible without the relevant keys. And finally, the fact that this has ECC memory suddenly creates a wonderful integrated system for all of those immutable backups and protected storage backups in the same line as BTRFS's and ECC's benefits towards data integrity and protection from things like bit rot. The hardware in this has become more appealing in the 12 months since its release, and some of the initial reviews of it, where shade was being thrown at it for in some respects feeling like a weaker alternative to the DS920 at that time, are now not as relevant anymore, again thanks to that device coming as well. Likewise, this system arrived at a time when Synology users were getting very, very concerned about the brand's position on hard drives, and several recent releases prior to this one had incredibly streamlined compatibility listings for the hard drives that could be used inside of them, with a lot of brands like WD and Seagate getting hugely ignored. And when the DS923 arrived on the scene, it did allow and several drives from Seagate, WD and Toshiba on those compatibility listings, which is absolutely great news. Now, 1 year down the line from that, I've got to say, it hasn't improved. Frankly, I think the compatibility on this, it's good that it supports Seagate and WD drives, but if you are going towards this box thinking, oh, I can use third-party drives now, great, it's worth bearing in mind that even 1 year after its release, the full range of third-party compatible drives, it's not fantastic. There is not a lot of drives on that list. If you cycle back to one of the older generation devices, again, your DS920 and such, you look at those and they have page after page after page after page of compatible hard drives there. And when you look at this device, I think you have 12, it might be more than that, maybe 13, 14 Seagate Iron Wolf drives there. And when you look at WD's drives, there's even less. There's loads of missing drives in that compatibility list. But one of the biggest glaring omissions is a complete lack of 18 TB drives and 20 TB drives and 22 TB drives from WD and Seagate. Now, Synology have released their own hard drives in the enterprise sector with the HAT 5300 and the HAT 3300. And with the enterprise grade drives, they have an 18 TB drive, and it is on the compatibility list for this. But in the year since its release, and WD and Seagate have been rolling out bigger and faster drives, none of them have appeared on the compatibility list, even though numerous websites, and not just us, but loads out there, have confirmed that those third-party drives work in this system. And Synology choosing not to add those drives to compatibility listings is a concern. Another thing about this device that I do think is worth talking about, and I said this in my original review, and I would say 12 months later it has only become truer. This device has done a phenomenal job at selling this device, the DS1522. Now this device arrived, I think, like half a year before this one, but this one arrives with an extra bay of storage. It can be expanded by 2 expansions when that can be expanded by 1. It arrives with 4 Ethernet ports when this only has 2, and it arrives with the same level of 10 GBE upgradability, and it arrives with 8 gig of memory out the gate, ECC, when this arrives with 4. But when you look at the price difference between them, it's only about 150 nicker. So right now, even 12 months later, I'll tell you right now, if you're looking at this, take a moment and look at the 1522, because you'll be surprised just how much bang you get for your buck. Another thing I waxed lyrical about on this device when it was launched, and again I am still totally pleased about it, is the fact that those M2 NVMe bays at the bottom, of course they can be used for caching, but they can be used for storage pools. A lot of users that are relatively new to the world of Synology may not know that it wasn't, it was only about a year ago that Synology decided, and that's the key word, decided to allow users to use these M2 NVMe slots for storage pools. And when this arrived on the scene, one of its chief selling points to a lot of users was it was the first device from them that allowed M2 NVMe's to be used as storage pools, and that was great stuff. And it meant users could not only have 4 hard drives there for their main storage, they could have some lovely super fast drive storage there at the bottom. 12 months later, it's not the only device anymore. There are other devices out there that support M2 NVMe SSD storage pools, including the DS923, including the DS423, including the 1522. That's right, they actually went backwards and enabled the feature on some of the older generation devices in the DS923 update. So that feature, as appealing as it was to this system, and if you've read reviews from a year ago that talked about how good it is to have that feature, bear in mind that in the year that has passed, other systems now support it. And the other thing worth bearing in mind that hasn't changed is the fact that this system needs you to use Synology SSDs in order to use that feature. We hoped that over the year Synology would add other drives for compatibility for storage pools on their system. Sadly, they did not. And 1 year down the line, if you want to use the M2 NVMe feature on this, you've got to use Synology SNV 3400 SSDs, which arguably are more expensive than other drives out there in the market. There are fewer capacities out there in the market than other drives, and ultimately, even if these M2 NVMe bays in some systems have lower speeds, more on that, in other videos with different PCIe lanes being supported, it all adds up to a great feature on this device at launch that 1 year later has sort of lost a lot of the wind in its sails for a lot of users out there. But switching things up just a little bit positive, I will say that a year down the line, this adapter to add 10 GBE to this NAS has grown on me, and it has grown on other users as well. That's right. Adding 10 GBE, 10 gigabit Ethernet to a NAS, and effectively having 10 times the potential bandwidth to your system, it's always been appealing, but it's also something that has been offered by NAS brands on their systems for more than 10, 20 years. It's not new, but whereas most of those systems provided that via a PCIe upgrade, and again, this is a Synology adapter for some of their other systems, this new DS923 at that time, new a year ago, arrived with a modified 10 GBE, a first-party module that slotted inside. And at the time, myself and other reviewers were slightly put out by, one, why couldn't you just use one of a million other different kinds of 10 GBE card that exist in the market, but two, the necessity for this at all on some systems, because a lot of users wanted 10 GB out the gate anyway and just pay a little bit more and have it on board. And moreover, this adapter, were they going to integrate it into other systems? Now, 1 year later, we can say, one, it is available on lots of other systems. It started being available on other systems prior to this one. Secondly, prices have come down. One of the earliest criticisms was because it was a unique module, The price, which seemed to have an RRP of 139 to 149, suddenly it was appearing online for like 200 nicker. Luckily, that price has come down, and this is a great deal more affordable than it was. And ultimately, I think it has borne fruit, that at least it allows users to get 10 GBE on this as an option. At the time, users, including myself, weren't completely in love with the rather proprietary nature of that upgrade, but it has to be said that a year later, me and others have warmed to it, and ultimately, much like that CPU, much like the integration of ECC memory, and luckily them not increasing the price, but unfortunately those modules costing a bit more, the 923 has become more appealing in the year since its launch. And although for a lot of users it still serves as a death nail to the previous DS923 that came before it, that was such a popular device, it has to be said that 1 year later, with the more flexibility in its pricing structure, has meant that this is now a much more appealing NAS than it was. But just bear in mind that before you go for this system, look up the DS1522. It does everything that does, and for the small price increase, you get a bunch of upgrades that are just not readily accessible on this, or that you'll have to pay extra for anyway, and the extra that you pay would cost more than just buying this 5-bay. But this has been the DS923 Plus 1 year later. Do you own one of these and you've enjoyed your experience with it? Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you scaled up. Maybe it didn't live up to the promises that it made. Let me know in the comments. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and have yourselves a fantastic week.